So first, I just wanted to thank everybody at the Iden Project, and especially Andy and Duncan, and especially Ernest. And where's Adam? Adam's gone. But thank you all so much for your work in putting this conference together. You've done a tremendous job, so thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just getting my feet wet in the extended cognition literature. So I work on virtue epistemology and virtue ethics. So this is a really broad brush paper. So I'm really hoping that you can give me feedback and give me, if you think there are directions that I should take or shouldn't take, I want to know. Okay, so I welcome all your suggestions. One other thing I can say is the way I'm sort of pitching this paper, I'm trying to pitch it to virtue epistemologists who work primarily on responsibilism, and I'm going to talk a little bit about responsibilism. So what I'm trying to do is sort of open up some of the literature on extended and distributed cognition to that crew of people. Right, trying to make it understandable to them. And I think maybe for this particular audience, what this paper will maybe accomplish is making virtue responsibilism a little more understandable to you, I hope. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, and I move and I'm loud and stuff, and if that overwhelms you, just tell me to quiet down. Okay, virtue epistemology has been largely concerned with individual agents. It is focused in part on the conditions under which an individual agent has an epistemic virtue. But are epistemic virtues and vices restricted to individuals? We sometimes attribute epistemic virtues and vices to groups, right? As when we say that a research team was open-minded, or a committee was dogmatic, or a police investigative unit was conscientious. This paper explores whether epistemic virtues and vices, as they're described by virtue epistemologists, can be distributed across groups and instantiated in collectives. In so doing, I try to provide an overview of the key features of epistemic virtues. So I'm not interested here in knowledge as such. I'm interested in thinking about what the key features of the epistemic virtues are, whether or not they contribute to knowledge. I try to provide an overview of the key features of epistemic virtues and a guide to the debates over extended and collective cognition that are relevant to those key features. So my hope is that this approach is going to help open up the literature on extended and distributed cognition to virtue epistemologists who've been focused on analyses of epistemic virtues. So I'm trying to provide sort of an overview and a basic map of some of the terrain and the challenges. Virtue epistemologists have developed two key analyses of epistemic virtue. Virtue-reliabilists, like Ernest, Sosa, and John Greco, have argued that epistemic virtues are roughly stable qualities that reliably produce true beliefs. These qualities range from hardwired capacities like vision to acquired skills like using a microscope to diagnose a patient to character traits like open-mindedness. Virtue-reliabilists think that we share some of our epistemic virtues like vision and memory with other animals. In contrast, virtue-responsibilists like Linda Zagzebski, James Montmarquet, Jason Baehr restrict epistemic virtues to acquired character traits for which the individual agent can be praised. Such traits include open-mindedness, intellectual tenacity, intellectual humility, and conscientiousness. Zagzebski, Montmarquet, and Baehr agree that epistemic virtues are personal qualities which require good motivations, but they disagree about whether epistemic virtues require reliability. So on the virtue-reliabilist side, everybody is gung-ho about reliability. On the virtue-responsibilist side, reliability may or may not be required. I'm a pluralist about virtues, so I think that both of these kinds of virtues are important and legitimate and get us things that are epistemically valuable. Despite their differences, virtue-reliabilists and virtue-responsibilists have all conceived of epistemic virtues as attributable to individual agents. They have made the natural assumption that epistemic virtues are dispositions that are located entirely within the skin and skull. of the agent who possessed them. But do we have to make this assumption? Is there anything about the key features of the virtues that would prevent them from being cognitively extended to artifacts and to being distributed across groups or instantiated in collectives? So the first chunk of this paper summarizes some of the key features of the reliabilist virtues. Again, just looking at the concept of virtue that's being used by virtue reliabilists, I'm not requiring that the concept of virtue is one that necessarily contributes to knowledge. The second section, I'm going to summarize, just so again, this is sort of like a brief, basic intro to some of the work on extended and distributed cognition. The third section, I'll talk about what I think are some of the, just a couple of the challenges for distributing reliabilist virtues across groups. And then I'll talk about responsibilist virtues, key features, and some challenges for responsibilist virtues, okay? Overall, I think what I want to conclude is that it's going to be harder to distribute responsibilist virtues than reliabilist virtues. I don't think that means that the challenges facing responsibilist virtues are insurmountable, but it means that if we want to distribute responsibilist virtues, if we want to make sense of attributions like the committee was conscientious, then we've got some work to do. And I think we might ultimately decide that the virtues and vices we attribute to groups lack some of the features of the virtues and vices that responsibilists ascribe to individuals. And if that happens, we might wonder which we should revise. Should we revise the notion of responsibilist virtue, or should we revise the notion that groups can have responsibilist virtues like open-mindedness? Okay, so first chunk is just some basic features of the reliabilist notion of virtue, okay? Led by Ernest, Sosa, and John Greco, virtue-reliabilism argues that epistemic virtues are stable, reliable dispositions. Roughly, they're dispositions to produce more true beliefs than false ones. Sosa and Greco employ an analysis of virtue that was endorsed, not of intellectual virtue necessarily, but an analysis of virtue that was endorsed by Plato in Republic and by Aristotle in Book 6 of Nicomachean Ethics. And they're both, Sosa and Greco are both explicit about this. This analysis does not restrict virtues to character traits, nor does it restrict virtue possession to people. In Sosa's words, and this is from one of his older works, Knowledge and Perspective, 1991. Sosa's words, quote, "There's a sense of virtue in which anything with a function does have virtues. The eye, after all, does have its virtues, and so does a knife." And more recently, Sosa has explained the conception of a competence or a virtue in this way, and this is from his Knowing Full Well, 2011. Knowing Full Well. Here's what Sosa says. "The sort of competence I have in mind is very broad and corresponds to uses of the word in biology, linguistics, and geology. It's not restricted to animate beings. It amounts rather to an ability to issue successful performances, and as when a ship performs well in a violent storm. Of course, the abilities and skills of a human being aren't excluded. Our epistemic competences, including learned ones, are certainly included." So that's all Sosa, okay? Accordingly, reliabilists argue that epistemic virtues are stable qualities that enable us to perform our epistemic functions well, or to produce good epistemic effects, like true beliefs. These qualities may be hardwired faculties, acquired skills, or even acquired character traits. The standard paradigms of reliabilist epistemic virtues are faculties, vision, memory, and reliable skills, right? Like using MRI films to diagnose a patient, doing derivations in logic. Though reliabilists have thus far focused on faculties and skills, Sosa is actually now starting to explore reliable character traits a bit in his most recent work. So there are 4 parameters that help define reliabilist virtues. I'm going to run through those fairly quickly. So the first one is that for reliabilists, epistemic virtues and vices need not be acquired. They can be hardwired faculties. Thus, Sosa argues that some of our intellectual virtues are natural while others are derived. In his words, some come courtesy of Mother Nature, and some courtesy of Mother Nature and her evolutionary ways, but many others must be learned. Likewise, John Greco thinks that intellectual virtues can include, quote, both a person's natural cognitive faculties and her acquired habits of thought. Vision, if reliable, is hardwired. For Sosa and Greco, our brains are wired to produce beliefs based on visual input. Doing derivations in logic, if reliable, is acquired. It requires practice and training. Okay, the second key feature of reliabilist virtues is that we need not be responsible for being epistemically virtuous or vicious. Specifically, we need not be responsible for possessing the virtues and vices that we do, nor need we be responsible for the operation of those virtues and vices. Since we have no control over which hardwired faculties we end up with, we can't be praised for ending up with reliable ones or blamed for ending up with unreliable ones. Nor can we control the operation of hardwired faculties, since they operate involuntarily and automatically. So according to virtue-reliabilism, we can have epistemic virtues and vices for whose possession and operation we're not responsible. We can't be praised or blamed. Third, and this in some ways I think engages with some of what Andy said earlier today, reliabilists think that epistemic virtues and vices need not be personal qualities. They can be subpersonal. Roughly, personal qualities tell us who we are as people. They reveal what an individual cares about and values. They express her rational judgments, her conception of value, and her motivations, where those motivations are informed by her judgments and values. In short, personal qualities express one's character. Personal epistemic qualities express one's epistemic character, one's epistemic values and motivations. They tell us who we are as thinkers. Hardwired epistemic virtues, like reliable vision, don't do this. They're subpersonal. So to illustrate, an open-minded person who values and loves truth and a dogmatic person who cares primarily about protecting his own worldview can both have the virtue of 20/20 vision. Such hardwired virtues tell us nothing about who these individuals are as thinkers. They tell us nothing about their epistemic values and motives. Even animals that are incapable of developing such values and motives can have the virtue of reliable vision. So virtue-reliabilists think that some, at least not all, but some epistemic virtues and vices are subpersonal. They certainly allow for that, and many of the virtues and vices that they're concerned with are subpersonal. Now, granted, Greco and Sosa have both recently argued that epistemic virtues, even hardwired ones, require a motivation for truth. They're both using this language. Thus, Greco has argued that epistemic virtues are stable, reliable qualities that involve a motivation to attain truth and avoid falsehood. And as Ernest has recently pointed out, Greco restricts epistemic virtues, or what he calls cognitive abilities, to stable dispositions that we manifest when we're thinking conscientiously, when we're trying to believe what is true. Greco does this in order to exclude strange and fleeting processes from the category of epistemic virtues. So Chi and Kuo talked about strange and fleeting processes this morning. But importantly, Greco doesn't think this conscientiousness has to be a personal quality. It need not be a quality that expresses one's epistemic values or the motivations informed by those values. It can simply consist in our normal default mode of trying to believe what is true. So in Greco's words, quote, "By thinking conscientiously, I don't mean thinking with an explicitly voiced purpose of finding out the truth. Rather, I intend the usual state that most people are in as a kind of default mode, the state of trying to form one's beliefs accurately." So as such, conscientiousness is a quality that we have as a species, qua human beings, rather than qua people. In this vein, Greco stresses that, quote, "There's no strong motivation condition, no control condition." I think Palermo's is also right to note that Greco wants us to focus on the reliability of the overall agent, conceived of as a stable, interconnected system of belief-forming processes. Greco wants his reliabilism to be an agent reliabilism, rather than a reliabilism of isolated belief-forming processes. And Ernest does a great job of pointing that out. But it's worth pointing out that even if Greco's integrative project succeeds, what we get is a rather weak notion of an agent. Many of the epistemic virtues that Greco rightly countenances, reliable vision, memory, and so on, are only qualities of agents in a weak sense. They're dispositions that the agent manifests when thinking conscientiously, and they're dispositions that cooperate and interact with other aspects of the agent's cognitive system. But they're not dispositions that agents have qua agents. They don't express any features of one's agency. They operate automatically and involuntarily, and one need not even be an agent in any strong sense to have them. Animals can have reliable vision. Okay, similarly, Sosa has argued that possessing epistemic virtue is sufficient for what he calls endeavoring or desiring to attain truth. But he ultimately thinks that such endeavoring can be, quote, involuntary, unconscious, and subpersonal, and that we can endeavor to attain truth when we're operating in what he calls our default mode. So on his view, epistemic virtues like reliable vision and memory entail a desire for truth while still operating subpersonally and involuntarily. The desire for truth they entail does not require any conscious decision to pursue truth or any positive action. The operation of such virtues and this desire for truth are part of our default trajectory. So neither Sosa nor Greco think that the requisite motivation for truth has to be a personal quality or a quality that we have qua agents. They agree that epistemic virtues need not be qualities we have qua persons. And finally, the fourth key feature of reliabilist virtues, which is obvious, is that epistemic virtues have to be reliable. Okay, so to be an epistemic virtue, a quality must be disposed to produce more true beliefs than false ones. But as Sosa and Greco point out, and was mentioned earlier today too, to be a virtue, a quality need not be disposed to produce more true beliefs than false ones in unusual conditions. Okay, it need only be disposed to produce a preponderance of truths in conditions we typically encounter. Relatedly, the possession of reliabilist virtues is externalist in the epistemological sense. One can, on their view, both of their views, one can possess a reliabilist virtue like 20/20 vision or a reliabilist vice like epistemic injustice, though they don't talk about epistemic injustice, without knowing that one possesses it. Possessing a reliabilist virtue or vice doesn't require the subject to believe that she possesses it or have access to it in any way. Externalism is arguably one of the strengths of reliabilist virtues. It captures the intuition that one way to be a good thinker is to simply produce epistemic goods consistently. And producing epistemic goods like truths is something that children and animals can do in addition to adults. Okay, so that's quick and dirty intro to reliabilist virtues. Next is quick and dirty intro to extended and distributed cognition. Okay, so traditionally, virtue-reliabilists have conceived of epistemic virtues as being located within the head of an individual. But is there anything about these key features of reliabilist virtues that prevent them from being extended to artifacts or distributed across groups? By way of introduction, recent work on extended and distributed cognition argues that cognitive processes need not be entirely located in an individual agent's head. They can extend beyond a single agent's head to include objects in the environment or other agents. Such external objects and people are constituent parts rather than independent causes of the cognitive process itself. This, of course, is the thesis of extended cognition. When cognition is distributed across a group, I take it this should be understood in the following way, that the group may produce results that the sum of its members working individually could not have produced on their own. Cognition that's merely extended to a group but not distributed across it won't do this. At least that's my understanding of the literature, but I'm happy for you to correct me if I'm wrong. So quickly, we'll start with extended cognition. Clark and Chalmers have argued that cognitive processes like memory can be extended to artifacts. Using common sense functionalism and the parity principle, they contend that if a part of the world functions as a process, which were it done in the head, we would have no hesitation in recognizing as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is part of the cognitive process, right? Cognitive processes ain't all in the head. So they argue that since we're willing to claim that Inga remembers that MoMA's on 53rd Street, we should also be willing to claim that Otto remembers that MoMA's on 53rd Street. In their words, quote, the notebook plays for Otto the same role that memory plays for Inga. Otto's notebook and Inga's memory are functionally equivalent. The only difference is that Inga's memory is located entirely inside her head, whereas Otto's isn't. Any inclination on our part to deny that Otto remembers is purely a result of our unjustified preference for skin and skull. Otto forms what Clark and Chalmers call a coupled system with his notebook. For an object like a notebook to participate in a coupled system, we've already talked about these conditions extensively. The object must be typically and reliably invoked, readily and easily accessed. The information in it must be automatically endorsed, and perhaps with the fourth condition must have been previously endorsed by the subject. Okay, so I think the coupled system of Otto and his notebook instantiate all the key features of the reliabilist virtues. And specifically, if reliabilists were going to use those key features to give an analysis of memory, that they would, the coupled system of Otto and his notebook would instantiate that reliabilist virtue. So for starters, the cognitive process that they describe is stable. Okay, it's a stable disposition. Otto's notebook is constant, he carries it all over the place, right? He consults it whenever he's supposed to, and so on. We can also assume, I suppose, if we want, that the process is reliable, right? That most of what Otto's written in his notebook is true, but really that's neither here nor there for what I'm trying to show. Because if most of what he's written in there is false, then he just instantiates a vice, a reliabilist vice, instead of a reliabilist virtue. So I'm not taking much to hang on reliability here. He could just have a vice. It also appears to be an externalist disposition. Okay, so, and I think Andy wasn't talking specifically about coupled systems this morning, but I think what Clark and Chalmers say in their original work, there's nothing in there, I think, to indicate that it's internalist rather than externalist. Separately, interestingly and arguably, unlike Inga's cognitive process, which is largely hardwired, Otto's is learned. As such, Otto may be, to some degree, praiseworthy for coming to possess it and exercise it. Okay? Perhaps Otto had to make some effort to develop the disposition to consult his notebook, whereas Inga didn't need to make an analogous effort in developing her mnemonic disposition. Likewise, in exercising his memory, Otto may make an effort, albeit a minimal one, to consult his notebook and look things up. Right? This sort of effortful action may be missing from Inga's consultation of her memory. In Inga, such consultation may often happen automatically and involuntarily. If the effort of consulting his notebook requires resisting competing motives, like the motive to just believe whatever's easiest, then Otto's memory may even express his epistemic agency or his commitment to the truth in a way that Inga's doesn't express hers. Okay, but I don't think too much hangs on this. I think either way, Otto and his notebook will count as having a reliabilist virtue. The key features of the reliabilist virtues don't seem to prevent the extension of cognition to artifacts. Okay, it's worth noting that Greco and Sosa seem open to the possibility that our cognitive virtues might be extended to artifacts. They certainly want to include learned processes that involve artifacts among the virtues, like reading MRI films, using telescopes, and so on. Now, they might initially conceive of these artifacts as external aids of a cognitive process, where the process is itself fully housed in the head. But there aren't any key features of the virtues that would prevent them from including these artifacts as part of the virtues rather than as external aids. I think there are two additional points here that are worthy of note. First, recall that the notion of virtue on which virtue reliabilism is based doesn't restrict virtues to agents or persons, eyes, knives, notebooks, objects, right? These things all have virtues on this notion. And second, they all have virtues because according to this notion, anything with a function has virtues. Virtues just are the qualities of a thing that enable it to perform its function well or attain its end. So the notion of virtue that grounds virtue reliabilism, I think, fits in nicely with the sort of common sense functionalism of Clark and Chalmers. Okay, so what about extending cognition to other people, all right, instead of artifacts, instead of objects? As Deborah Tollefson has argued, two people can form a coupled system that meets all of Clark and Chalmers' conditions. So I'm going to give you a somewhat autobiographical example. I was department chair for 3 years. So consider the frazzled and overworked department chairperson and her steadfast, supportive, and reliable office manager. Suppose that the two have worked together for a decade and that the chair easily and regularly gets access to the office manager. The chair sees the office manager at work, texts her, emails her, calls her. I was a very bad chair. I tortured my office manager. Okay, suppose the chair often gets overwhelmed and has difficulty remembering her appointments. The chair regularly and reliably consults the office manager, who supplies the chair with the needed information that the chair originally gave to the office manager with this express purpose in mind. We can also suppose that the chair automatically endorses the information that the office manager provides. Here, too, it seems, we have a coupled system that plays the same functional role as biological memory. The chair's cognition has been extended to the office manager. Okay, let's move on to a case of distributed cognition. A group's distributed cognition can produce a result that can't be produced by any of its individual members working alone. Cognition that's merely extended but not distributed won't do this. In the example above, the results that get produced, right, things like you have an appointment with the provost today at 3, right? The results that get produced were all produced by an individual member of the coupled system, the office manager. But when cognition's distributed across a group, and this is a quote from Thainer, the group may collectively achieve something that could not have been done by any single member, even the most capable working alone, nor by the sum of members working individually toward the same outcome. A cognitive process that is distributed across a group isn't an aggregate of the processes of its individual members working alone and can't be reduced to the processes of its individual members working alone. It's a cognitive process of the group in its own right, and it emerges in part from the dynamic interaction among its members. So to illustrate, my 5 college roommates and I recently reconstructed the configuration of roommates on the men's floor of our freshman dormitory. I know, this is what I spend my time talking about. Okay, so we did this via active discussion, dialogue, and deliberation. Did Jeff live with Frank or Mike? I remember going to a party in Jeff and Frank's room. Mike lived with Cheeks, didn't he? No, Mike lived with Adam. I dated Adam, remember? Through this interactive collaboration, we were able to produce the configuration of roommates. None of us could have produced this from memory on our own. We went to college in the late 80s. It's also reasonable to think that we wouldn't have been able to do it without interacting. We collectively achieved a result the sum of us working individually couldn't have achieved. We've done this before, and we actually do this fairly consistently in reconstructing events from our college days, like parties and graduation and this sort of thing. So I think that as a group, my college roommates and I have a rudimentary form of what Daniel Wegner calls transactive memory. Wegner thinks married couples are paradigms of transactive memory. Their dialogue and interaction about a past event, like the birth of their first child or moving into their first apartment, can produce a mnemonic result that's richer than the result recalled by either individual. Wegner argues that a transactive memory system, or a TMS for short, retrieves information via the interaction of its group members, but also encodes and stores information through interaction. Transactive memory systems often divide up cognitive labor. The group collaboratively allocates the storage of domain-specific information to members with expertise in that domain. In Thainer's words, quote, "The integrated functioning of a differentiated TMS requires that group members develop a shared set of higher order or transactive memories for keeping track of who knows what and for trusting each other's expertise." That's Thainer. Okay. These transactive memories help the group determine which of its members should store incoming information, and they help the group cue the experts when domain-specific information needs to be retrieved. And it's also thought that a group won't constitute a transactive memory system without some kind of convergent expectations. So the group must have beliefs about what would constitute a positive outcome and must share some conception of the roles that its members would play in achieving the positive outcome. Okay, challenges. Just a couple of challenges for distributing reliabilist virtues. Okay, so first, does distribution harbor internalist restrictions? Do any of the key features of reliabilist virtues prevent them from being extended to other agents or distributed across a group? Reliabilist virtues are externalist in the epistemological sense. So to possess one, you don't have to believe or know that you possess it. You need not have beliefs about nor know how your cognitive process works. You don't have to have access to the fact that you have the process or use the process. But transactive memory systems, as they're ordinarily described, seem to be epistemically internalist. They seem to require groups, or at least group members, to have beliefs and perhaps even knowledge about who among the groups is an expert in which domain, and who's storing what sort of information. They also require groups or their members to have some kind of convergent expectations, shared beliefs about how they're all going to how they're going to attain a positive outcome, how they're going to succeed in remembering. So it seems the groups in a TMS must have some higher level beliefs about how their process works. So is this a problem for virtue-reliabilists like Sosa? Early on in Knowledge and Perspective, interestingly, Sosa defined intellectual virtues in terms of the inner nature of an agent. So really early on in his work, I think his commitments precluded him from making any kinds of claims about extended or distributed cognition. But since then, he's changed his view. He now thinks that competences can be, quote, socially seated and seated in, quote, broader social units that include but go beyond the individual. And this is from his 2007. So on Sosa's view, a competence need not be exclusively seated in an individual believer. And yet, the sorts of groups that Sosa envisions are not nearly as organized or internalist as are TMSs under their standard description. So Sosa's primarily worried about responding to these kinds of counterexamples that involve testimony, okay? So Sosa argues that in cases of testimonial knowledge, it's a group of people, not just a single individual, who has a competence. But on his view, this group can span millennia, can be motley, and in his words, need form no organization, no socially organized entity. Now, Sosa does claim that the group's competence will include the believer's own competence to trust testimony. But presumably, for Sosa, the competence to trust testimony is itself going to be externalist. It won't involve higher level internalist requirements. So I think there are several reasonable avenues of reply to this worry. First, don't my college roommates and I constitute a TMS without having any higher level beliefs about how we store and retrieve information about our college days, right? The information we're storing and retrieving isn't domain specific, doesn't require specific expertise beyond having been present at the events. So there's no need to formally divide the labor among us. Our TMS is a pretty straightforward one. Accordingly, it seems that TMSs need not be as highly organized as those described by Wegner and Thainer, nor need my roommates and I formally agree on a positive outcome. Our default trajectory for truth may help explain why. In accordance with that default trajectory, we may simply fall into a pattern of using deliberation and dialogue to reconstruct events from our college days. We may do so without bothering to reflect on how we do so. We may instantiate a TMS without thinking about it. And presumably, I think this will be true of lots of married couples as well. Second, reasonable, I think, avenue of reply, even highly organized TMSs may not require their members to have higher level beliefs. TMSs could be built into corporate institutions in a top-down manner so that the employees who make up a TMS need not themselves have higher level beliefs about it. The employees might communicate in all the appropriate ways with all the other members of their TMS simply because they're following orders from above. In this manner, the employees, as a group or as individuals, can constitute a TMS without themselves knowing that they do. They can even produce positive outcomes consistently just by following orders, right? So the environment, the institution can be structured in a way to form TMSs where the people in them don't know that they're in them. I think Sosa's analysis can also accommodate more organized TMSs where they do occur. Sosa thinks that adults can, and as Chen-Kuo said earlier today, can and often do reflect on our cognitive virtues. Sosa simply argues that such reflection isn't required for possessing those virtues. And so there's nothing to prevent Sosa's analysis from accommodating cases in which we've formally reflected and agreed upon the methods for storing and retrieving information with a group. And indeed, for Sosa, this kind of reflection might be a sort of paradigm case of a metacompetence or a second order competence, the kind we were talking about this morning. Finally, it's worth noting that neither the extension of cognition to artifacts nor the extension of cognition to other agents commits us to epistemic internalism. Mere possession of a skill, like consulting a notebook or using a microscope, doesn't strictly require higher level beliefs about the skill in question or how it works. And here we've already heard some disagreement in the last 2 days about this issue. As Sosa contends, one might be skilled in archery without knowing how one's able to reliably hit the target. Reliably hitting the target is what matters for skill. Being able to explain why one's reliable or having higher level beliefs about the process and how it works isn't required. Likewise, a student might come to acquire a cognitive skill without bothering to have higher level beliefs about how or why this skill works. I think actually we see, as logic professors, we will sometimes see this. Of course, as adult humans, some of us will reflect on and assess our cognitive processes and may even come to know which of our processes are more and less reliable. But mere possession of those processes doesn't require this. One can have a cognitive competence or skill without reflecting on it, at least I think from Sosa's position. Nor does the extension of cognition to other agents strictly require higher level beliefs, though such beliefs might be present. And so I think we could say something, I'm going to skip over this, but I think we could say something similar about the case of the coupled system of the department chair and the office manager. Okay, so I don't think the department chair and the office manager have to know that they're participating in a coupled system. I think that they can in fact instantiate and enter into a coupled system without realizing that they are. And we might be able to say, oh, well, you know, the university administration recognizes that department chairs everywhere are overwhelmed, and so they set up these rules about how department chairs and their staff are supposed to interact or something like that. Okay, so I think there are responses to this kind of worry. Second challenge, we've heard a little bit about this afternoon. So spooky group minds and group beliefs. So Riza Larudi has argued that, quote, the commitment to group minds would be unavoidable should virtues construed as cognitive faculties be attributed to groups. For this reason, Larudi restricts his exploration of cognitive virtues to cognitive character traits rather than cognitive faculties. He doesn't tell us exactly why he thinks virtues as faculties inexorably lead to group minds, or why cognitive character traits don't. Perhaps he thinks that since in individuals, faculties are subsystems of minds, they would likewise need to be subsystems of group minds should they be distributed. I think that would probably be a natural assumption to make, but in any case, Larudi thinks that group minds don't exist or are metaphysically spooky. Relatedly, we might worry that attributing reliabilist virtues to groups might commit us to the existence of group beliefs. Reliabilist virtues are belief-forming and belief-sustaining faculties, or at least many of them are. And in individuals, beliefs are inner states. We heard about this afternoon. So I think we're right to be suspicious of group minds. Groups don't have inner states or internal stuff in the way that individual people do. But I also think they're promising lines of reply here, and I think we saw one such this afternoon. So Clark and Chalmers use common sense functionalism to argue that Otto has a dispositional belief. He believes that MoMA's on 53rd Street, and he believes that even before he consults his notebook. I think common sense functionalism gets us started on a reply to this worry about spooky minds and beliefs. But even if common sense functionalism is still committed to some kind of interstate or internal stuff that instantiates the functional role, then I think we can make the kind of move that Deborah Tollefson makes to dispositionalism, where dispositionalism isn't just like fancy behaviorism. It involves, so it's not just about dispositions of action, right? It involves the view that mental states are dispositions of whole systems, where those systems could be composed of agents, artifacts, combinations of agents and artifacts. In Tollefson's words, mental states are dispositional states in that they're, quote, defined in terms of what an agent will do, say, and think under certain circumstances. I think this puts us on a promising path. It would enable us to talk about a group's mental states without committing us to the claim that groups have internal states. So groups can still have beliefs, but beliefs won't require the existence of a group mind in a spooky sense. So I think there are going to be challenges for distributing reliabilist virtues to groups of people based on the key features of reliabilist virtues, but I think those challenges are going to be relatively easy to handle. How am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
What, really? Okay, all right, I'll be really fast. Okay, okay,
We've got half an hour, so it depends how much discussion you want.
Okay, all right. Well, I want discussion. All right, so I'm gonna really quickly. So just as there are 4 features of virtue-reliabilism, right? So the features of virtue-reliabilism, the virtues don't have to be acquired, they can be hardwired, right? They could be skills, they could be full-blown character traits, right? We don't have to be praiseworthy or blameworthy for them. They don't have to be personal, they could be subpersonal, and they have to be reliable, okay? So there are 4 corresponding features for virtue-responsibilists. So virtue-responsibilists think, in contrast with virtue-reliabilists, that virtues do have to be acquired. And they think that virtues have to be acquired because they think that virtues are praiseworthy and blameworthy. They are necessarily praiseworthy and blameworthy. And they think that we can't be praised or blamed for hardwired faculties. Okay? So they think virtues have to be acquired, they can't be hardwired. They think, second, that we're, surprisingly, responsible for our virtues and vices, right? That's why they're called responsibilists. So they think that virtues and vices are the kinds of traits for which we're responsible. There's disagreement in the literature about exactly what we're responsible for, according to responsibilists. So some responsibilists, like Linda Zagzebski, think that we are responsible for coming to possess our virtues. So Zagzebski thinks that if we acquire a trait and we didn't put any effort on our own into acquiring that trait, then whatever trait we end up with does not count as a virtue, okay? So on her view, we have to put effort into acquiring a virtue. The individual who possesses the virtue has to be praiseworthy for coming to possess it, okay? Not everybody buys that in the literature. For instance, James Montmarquet, he thinks that's false, that we don't have to be responsible or praiseworthy for coming to possess a trait in order for it to be a virtue, but he thinks that we do have to be responsible or praiseworthy for its operation, for exercising it, okay? Both Zagzebski and Montmarquet are thinking about responsibility in terms of control. Okay, so they both think that responsibility entails control. Zagzebski thinks that we have a degree of control over the traits that we come to possess. Montmarquet thinks that we have a degree of control over the exercise of our virtues. Okay, so control is key for them. Let's see. So the third main feature of responsibilism is that responsibilists think that epistemic virtues and vices are qualities of people qua people, and qualities of people qua agents. So they think, and they're not talking about traits like reliable vision and reliable memory. They're talking about traits like being open-minded, being conscientious, being intellectually humble, being intellectually courageous. They think that these traits all require motivational components and belief components. So in order to count as having the virtue of open-mindedness, you have to have a particular psychological profile. You have to be disposed to care about truth appropriately. And they think that on their view, for responsibilists, caring about truth appropriately is not something we sort of pop out of the womb with, right? It's not our default mode. It's not something that we all have qua humans. Caring about truth appropriately is something we have to work at to get. Right, so they say, look, probably not us. I mean, philosophers are, if anything, we probably care too much about truth and too little about some other things. But they would say most people don't care about truth enough, right? And so in order to care appropriately about truth, we have to work at that. That's a motivation that we have to acquire over time, okay? They also think that in order to be open-minded, we have to care about considering alternative ideas. So we have a sort of dual motivation. We have to care about truth. The caring about truth is going to be common for all of the responsibilist intellectual virtues. And that motivation to get the truth is going to spawn the motivations that are distinctive of individual virtues. So the motivation, if you're motivated to get the truth, and you think that you're more likely to get the truth if you consider a bunch of alternative ideas, then you're going to be motivated to consider alternative ideas, okay? So they think there's clearly a motivational component. They also think there's a belief component. So it's, in order to have a virtue like open-mindedness, you have to have beliefs about what's epistemically valuable and what's not. So you have to have beliefs, you have to believe that the truth is an epistemically good thing, okay? Now this doesn't have to be the kind of belief that only epistemologists have, right, or only philosophers have. It could be, a sort of dispositional belief where you might ask one of your students something like, when they're revising a paper that you've given them comments on, say, you might say to them, well, what do you care about here? Do you care about just getting a good grade, or do you care about actually producing an argument that's good or right, or that's going to produce knowledge or truth, right? So they don't have to have any really well worked out view of epistemic value or anything like that, but they have to have some beliefs about what's epistemically valuable and what's not. Okay, and one last thing. So responsibilists are also employing a notion of virtue that's endorsed by Aristotle. So interestingly, reliabilists and responsibilists are both getting their sort of basic notions of virtue from the ancients. But responsibilists, they get their notion of virtue from the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, okay? So not from Nicomachean Ethics 6, where Aristotle's specifically talking about intellectual virtue, and he's using the Platonic notion in Nicomachean Ethics 6 that anything with a function can have a virtue, essentially, right? And so if if our main intellectual function is to get truths, then qualities that get us truths are going to count as intellectual virtues. In the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle uses a notion of virtue according to which virtues are stable dispositions that require appropriate motives, appropriate emotions, appropriate actions, and appropriate ways of seeing the world, okay? Okay. So I just want to say, I'm just going to read a tiny bit, and then I promise I will be quiet. just a couple of challenges that I see, and I think so a couple of the challenges that I see for distributing responsibilist virtues. So the first two challenges, I think, are going to be well known to everybody here. So the challenge of group beliefs and group motivations. So Jürgen already talked about the challenge. We talked a little bit about the challenge of group beliefs. Responsibilists, because there is a belief component in responsibilist virtues. You have to have beliefs about what's epistemically valuable and what's not. Responsibilists are going to have to, if we're going to extend or distribute responsibilist virtues to groups, we're going to have to make sense of groups having beliefs, right? We're also going to have to make sense of groups having motivations. Okay, so I think these are both going to be problems that the responsibilist is going to have to handle. There's also, responsibilists think that, so to be open-minded, you have to care about truth, you have to care about considering alternative ideas. Motives aren't enough, right? You have to actually consider alternative ideas when you should and consider the right ones. So motivation is required for responsibilist virtue. Dispositions of action are required for responsibilist virtue. And so the sort of second key challenge, I think, for responsibilists, if we're going to distribute responsibilist virtues across groups, is we're going to have an analysis of group action and group agency. Okay? Now people are at work on these, okay? So there are lots of folks working very hard, mostly within the context of collective epistemology, trying to give analyses of group belief, trying to give analyses of group intention, as Fred talked about earlier. He was talking about Tuomela. Tuomela tries to give an analysis of group intention. And folks who are trying to give analyses of group agency, like List and Pettit, for instance. Okay, so I think those challenges are ones we're familiar with. I want to talk about a couple of new challenges. So there's three quick ones I want to talk about. So the first one is finding a functionalism that does justice to akrasia, or weakness of will. So many of the key analyses of group mental states presuppose some kind of common sense functionalism. So I think Gilbert does, List and Pettit do, and I think that's right, okay, as an analysis of group mental states. But one worry is that common sense functionalism isn't going to be sophisticated enough to distinguish epistemic weakness of will from epistemic vice. And this distinction is something that responsibilist analyses are going to demand. So the dogmatic agent, so a person who has the vice of dogmatism, and the epistemically acratic agent, the person who has epistemic weakness of will, could behave in exactly the same way, okay? So just like the person who's morally self-indulgent and the person who's weak-willed on the moral side do exactly the same things, right? They eat way too much chocolate cake, they drink too much tequila, they smoke all, and so on, okay? The epistemically acratic person and the dogmatic person might do exactly the same things. But responsibilists are going to recognize that they may not have the same beliefs. The dogmatic person may have false beliefs about what is epistemically valuable, whereas the weak-willed person may have true beliefs about what's valuable. The weak-willed person might even know what she's supposed to do, but she just can't get herself to do it. So I think this is a potential problem. I think this can be resolved if we can come up with a sophisticated enough version of functionalism. So functionalism isn't behaviorism. The acratic person and the dogmatic person are going to have different psychological profiles. And so we should, in theory, be able to come up with a sophisticated enough version of functionalism that's going to do justice to those different profiles, right? So the dogmatic person doesn't have competing motivations, right? Whereas the acratic person does. But I think given the ubiquity in the literature on agency and group agency, given the ubiquity in that literature of the appeals to the rationality of groups, I think this worry about accounting for epistemic weakness of will has to be on our radar. Just a couple more quick ones. So group emotion. So responsibilists have not had a lot to say yet about what emotions are involved in virtues like being open-minded, for instance. But intellectual courage is one of the classic responsibilist virtues. And some responsibilists have given analyses of intellectual courage in terms of, for instance, defending one's beliefs in the face of fear as appropriate. Okay, so they think that having, being afraid, being appropriately afraid in the context of inquiry, I guess, is required for intellectual courage. And I think this is going to be a problem for distributing responsibilist virtues to groups if emotions like fear end up being non-cognitive. So Jesse Prince has argued that emotions are embodied appraisals, that we're not going to have emotions like fear without a body. So on his view, one has the emotion of fear when one registers physiological changes in the body, and where those changes represent danger in the environment. So this may not be the case with all emotions, right? Emotions like shame may have cognitive components, but I think if emotions are non-cognitive, it's going to be difficult to figure out how to distribute responsibilist virtues to groups. So responsibilist virtues like intellectual courage. Groups don't have bodies. We might try to do this in terms of emotional contagion. If we do, I think we'd end up with a purely summative account of which emotions groups have. And that may just be what we have to do. Finally, responsibility. So there's lots of work on collective responsibility. I think we might think that there are genuine collectives. In this, we might think that there are groups that are genuine collectives in the sense that they can't be merely summative. So Miranda Fricker has recently argued that we each have multiple practical identities as parents, as members of an epistemology class, as members of the promotion committee, as members of a church, and so on, and that there can be conflict between the commitments associated with one's different practical identities. Fricker thinks that an individual might have some qualities only as a member of a group and not as a private individual. And if so, this opens up the possibility that a group might have a virtue or vice that none of its members have as a private individual. So maybe the students in my epistemology class sadly manifest epistemic virtues qua group members of the class that they don't manifest as private individuals. And if this is the case, if group virtues and vices can be emergent and non-summative, I think it's really hard to see how possession of a group virtue or vice could require control over its acquisition. So I think this might actually give us some reason for revising Linda Zagzebski's view about what the responsibilist virtues require. Okay, and I'm going to be quiet. Thank you guys for being so patient with me.